The third movement of SMiLE, which is sometimes known as the Elemental Suite, starts with the Johnny Mercer pen track I Wanna Be Around before blending into Workshop, which is basically Brian using a technique called Foley or Foley recording, where you kind of record different sounds, where like different everyday sounds essentially. It was done more in kind of avant-garde music, and it would have been done in things like film and stuff like that, to get sounds. But Brian was incorporating that into SMiLE by using things from a Workshop to give that kind of vibe and atmosphere. And I think it just works really well. As a track, it's not a track. It's just kind of a nice little thing, which is cool. Vegetables or Vegetables was born out of a time where Brian had an interest in healthy living. In a 1967 article, Brian said, "I want to turn people onto vegetables. Good natural food, organic food. Health is an important element in spiritual enlightenment, but I do not want to be pompous about it, so we will engage in a satirical approach." A few years later, in 1969, Brian would open a health food store called the Radiant Radish in West Hollywood.
Well, he decided one night that he wanted for all of us to be healthy. So he somehow got rid of all the furniture that was in the living room, and they were all, I walked in and the whole living room was just blue mats, blue tumbling mats.
I wanted other people to exercise, but I really didn't want to do it. I was too lazy to do it.
Well, he would be the team leader and get everybody doing exercises in the pool. Come on, this is good for you. And then after a while, you start going, I don't want to. It's cold out, man. I don't.
Yeah, there's a contradiction there that I didn't want to do it myself, but I want other people to do it.
Brian would then take the song and we'd have to act it out. If it was Vegetables, I became, I think, David Carrot or Dave Carrot, whatever I was. And Mike Vossi was the celery.
I thought Brian was doing all of it with a great sense of humor. And let's keep in mind that this was a time when people were first starting to think about eating healthfully. A lot of what he's saying made a lot of sense.
Within SMiLE, there's like loads of lore. And I think that's what's kind of interesting about it, because there's lore. But there's that Paul McCartney lore, which is true that Paul McCartney did visit the Beach Boys session in 1967. But it's unknown if he actually appears on the finished version of Vegetables. But McCartney said, "I just went round to the studio because they invited me. I just thought it would be fun to sit there and watch them record, because I'm a big fan. And so I was there, and then it was, I think, Brian who came over and said, 'Oh, Paul, got a favour to ask. Would you mind recording something?' I thought, oh no, but great, I could do that. Oh God, I'm going to be singing on a Beach Boys record or something, I got a bit kind of intimidated and thought, okay, there goes nothing. And they said, well, what we want you to do is go in there and just munch. Well, I can do that. So if you hear somebody munching celery, that's me." Sessions for the track were said to have taken place between October 17th, 1966 and ended on June 15th, 1967. As with many Beach Boys tracks, Vegetables was recorded in various studios such as Columbia, Western, Sound Recordings and Gold Star, and they also recorded some vocals at Brian's place in Bel Air. The Beach Boys recorded a rudimentary version of Vegetables, a demo with different lyrics and a different vocal arrangement, on October 17, 1966. Band archivist Craig Slowinski suggests that the session may have taken place on this day, however the exact date is unknown. This demo contained the unused cornucopia verse. In February 1967, Brian announced that Vegetables would be the lead single from SMiLE, which in doing so exacerbated tensions between himself and Van Dyke Parks, who felt that the song was one of the weaker efforts on SMiLE. According to David Anderley, creative differences between Van Dyke and Brian had escalated since February. Van Dyke was against having the song as the album's lead single, saying, "I didn't want Vegetables to be given too much emphasis. For SMiLE, that celebrated collaboration, to be dependent on a commercial release of Vegetables as a single was tremendously ill-advised wherever it came from." On November 4th, 1966, Brian produced a session dedicated to capturing a humorous situation featuring himself, Van Dyke Parks, Danny Hutchins, Michael Vossi, and a man named Bob. Towards the end of that recording, the group plays a rhythm on bongos while chanting, "Where's my beets and carrots, and I've got a big bag of vegetables." Brian produced another humorous section on November 16th, this time dedicated to recording mock disagreements between Vossi and session drummer Hal Blaine. The first major session dedicated to tracking any part of Vegetables took place on January 3rd, 1967. However, at this time, part of the song had been configured as a section of Heroes and Villains and logged with the title Do a Lot. Material recorded that day did not become part of the finished song. Van Dyke Parks and Brian Wilson temporarily dissolved their partnership on the 2nd of March after a session of Heroes and Villains. A recording session for vocals on Vegetables was held the next day, but further session dates scheduled on March 28th and March 30th were cancelled. Van Dyke returned to the project after March 31st. The band spent at least 8 studio dates recording Vegetables before embarking on a US tour on April 14th. Van Dyke's last recorded appearance on the album sessions was for a Vegetables date on April 14th, after which he withdrew from the project. Wilson then took a 4-week break from the studio. On April 29th, band publicist Derek Taylor reported that the single, Backed It Wonderful, would soon be released. He described it as a light and lyrical day-to-day greengrocery song on which Al Jardine sings a most vigorous lead. Holidays was recorded on September 8th, 1966 at Western. It's a really sweet little tune and contains marimbas and woodwinds. It's unknown would there have been lyrics to it, but I'm not sure there would have been because it was recorded quite early in the process of SMiLE. So, who knows, it could have been just one of these little fragments and vignettes that Brian had wrote. But it does incorporate some of the same instruments like marimba on the next track, Windchimes. Windchimes begins with a really mellow vibe, sung beautifully as usual by Carl Wilson, before erupting into this bombastic sound with sax, drums and more. Lyrically, Van Dyke's words complement Brian's pictorial music, and Van Dyke does add a nice pun, in the late afternoon you're hung up on wind chimes. Brian's wife at the time, Marlon, said, "We went shopping one day and we bought home some wind chimes. We hung them outside the house, and then one day while Brian was sitting around, he sort of watched them out of the window and then he wrote the song. I think that's how it happened. Simple. He does a lot of things that way." Windchimes, in its original form, was first tracked on August 3rd, 1966 at Gold Star Studios. Another version of the song was tracked on October 3rd, 1966, which was later followed by further overdubs on October 5th and 10th at Western Studios. The track is in the key of C, and surprisingly for a Brian Wilson composition, there are no key changes, but there are some nice slash chords. Van Dyke Park said, "When we got to Windchimes on the mallet tremolos, I remember at that point Brian asked me to play mallets, but the fellow who really played them was Gary Coleman, the great percussionist, who came down to do a lot of percussion for the album. We discovered that, by recording at half speed, you could come down an octave, so you could play anything at half speed, an octave lower, raise the speed to normal speed, and then you'd sound like you could play like a son of a bitch, like an expert. It gave you velocity that you didn't really have." And now we come to the darkest track on SMiLE, which might give us insight into Brian's psyche at the time, Fire. Fire might be the most avant-garde track Brian ever wrote. There's a slight uneasy sound to it with the strings. It starts off in this sinister, jovial way before going into this heavy avant-garde sound starting at 41 seconds. It really does feel like a song spiralling out of control, which I think mirrors Brian's increasingly troubled mental health state at the time. And yet it really does evoke the sound of fire by what the strings are playing. Again, Brian was excellent at painting pictures with his music. Even though the track was recorded early-ish in the SMiLE project, it does show, in hindsight, Brian starting to get into a darker headspace. Fire was produced on November 28, 1966 at Gold Star Studios with 15 session musicians, including 3 bassists, 4 flutists and a string sextet. To help set the mood, Brian instructed everyone in the studios to don a fire helmet and had a bucket of burning wood placed in the recording space so that the area would smell of smoke. Within a few days of the session, Brian was frightened to learn that a nearby building had burnt down shortly after the recording was made. He believed that the recording somehow contributed to the fire and decided to shelve the recording. All these things added to Brian's fragile mental state at the time.
Recording Fire was like we brought fire helmets for the musicians, little toy fire hats. and I brought in a bucket of fire, and it made the mood come real good. Go real good.
All of a sudden, the wheel in the trash barrel on fire was not conducive to breathing. Don't worry, it won't be on the record. You know, they won't hear it. Oh, that's great.
Now, remember, there would have been 5, 6, 7 of these going on at once. Everybody had a whistle.
I was feeling unhappy, so I thought that fire tape would express the crazy, weird thoughts I was going through.
Down the street from the studio, there was a warehouse that burned down to the ground. It burned to the ground. And I thought it was my fault when we did the fire tapes that day. I thought that the fire tapes, the songs that the music that we created about fire, I thought that was responsible for the building burning down to the ground.
There was like, all of this was so much fun. And I was watching the guy in crisis. And I knew that all of a sudden, if this was a joke, it was at someone's expense. And whose expense was it but Brian's?
Van Dyke Parks recalled that an elemental concept did not come up until later in the project. Van Dyke Parks said about fire, "I avoided the fire sessions like the plague. I didn't want to embarrass myself, and I thought it was regressive behaviour." The instrumental was recorded in 18 takes, after which Brian recorded the crackling noises made by the burning wood and mixed them into the track. Jules Siegel is quoted saying that Brian said, "Yeah, I'm going to call this Mrs. O'Leary's Fire, and I might just scare a whole lot of people." Fire is the least melodic track on SMiLE, but I think it's a really cool track. It's interesting. It's so it's very unique in its sound, and definitely unique in 1967. The fire is then put out by the water of Love to Say Dada. The song did morph into Cool Cool Water some years later, so maybe I'm stretching saying it's water, but hey, I think it works. It was the last song Brian worked on for SMiLE. The interesting thing is that in early May, Derek Taylor announced that SMiLE was abandoned, yet Brian recorded this after the announcement. From the 16th of May till the 18th of May 1967, Brian produced 3 sessions dedicated to the track at Gold Star Studios. Another session scheduled for May 19 would have likely seen further work on the track that was cancelled. According to music historian Keith Badman, these occasions marked the final sessions for the SMiLE album. The final track is one that is contentious, as people are unsure if it was ever going to be on the album. I would imagine Capitol would have forced Brian to put it on the record, as I said earlier, as a way to sell records. The track, of course, is the progressive pop masterpiece, Good Vibrations. I've actually made a full video on this track, so I'm not going to go too much into it. But personally, I think it fits SMiLE. Creating music is very similar to painting because you're using different colours. You know, different instruments have different colours and different sounds have different colours. So you're kind of just painting, really. And yeah, I like the way Brian painted, let's put it that way. But I think one of the important instruments of Good Vibrations is the theremin, or more specifically, the electrotheremin. The electrotheremin, or the tannerin, played on Good Vibrations, was created by Paul Tanner and Bob Whitesell. As well as being one of the inventors of the electrotheremin, Paul Tanner also played it on Good Vibrations, and he had previously played it on I Just Wasn't Made for These Times. The electrotheremin differs than the traditional theremin. It's actually easier to play an electrotheremin. The instrument features a tone and portamento similar to that of a theremin, but with a different control mechanism. It consists of a sine wave generator with a knob controlling the pitch, placed inside a wooden box. The pitch knob is attached to a slider on the outside of the box with some string. The first session for Good Vibrations took place on the 17th of February 1966 at Gold Star Studios. It was logged as a pet sound session. Good Vibrations was reported to have used over 90 hours of tape. One estimate of the overall production costs are between $50,000 and $75,000. It took 17 sessions to complete the track and was recorded in 4 different studios, which are Western, Columbia, Gold Star and Hollywood. Though on the box set, the SMiLE box set, it says that some of it was recorded at Sunset Sound. now we've come to that part of why SMiLE was never finished. I think you're never going to get a definitive answer of why SMiLE was never finished, because I think it was many things. I mean, Brian said in 2004,
I'll tell you, from my heart. In 1967, the reasons why I didn't finish SMiLE was Mike didn't like it. I thought it was too experimental. I thought that the fire tape was too scary. I thought that people wouldn't understand where my head was at that time. Those were the reasons.
I think it's not one thing, I think it's many things, like the reluctance from Mike and the pressure that was on Brian and Brian's mental health problems and his drug use. I know some people have said, the drug use wasn't the problem. It's like, if you're taking copious amounts of drugs every day, they're going to affect your day-to-day life. That's just a reality. I also think the release of Heroes and Villains and subsequent failure of it, even though it did get to number 12 in the US charts, it was coming off the back of this massive hit in Good Vibrations. So anything less than number 1 at that point was deemed a failure. And it was like a truncated version of Heroes and Villains too. It wasn't like the version I think Brian had in mind that he wanted to release. So all these things, I think, just mounted on Brian. And you have to look at Brian's mental health at the time. He went to a movie called Seconds, and when he walked in, it said, "Hello, Mr. Wilson." And he thought the movie was about him. He thought it was his life playing out inside that movie. And, he thought his house was bugged by Phil Spector. He thought the fire session started the fire, the buildings. And his dad, Murray, did have private investigators going around following Brian. So I think all these things, they would take a toll on anyone. And he probably just couldn't deal with it.
He just went somewhere else. He checked out. Or it checked out. I don't know if he made a conscious decision for him to get sick the way he did. He just got sick.
He kind of had no one there to kind of back him up, because Van Dyke Parks had left at that time. And at the time, Brian had a lot of people around him that were using him, and they were just yes men. He, of course, had people who were looking out for him, were genuine people, but he also had a lot of people who were just leeching off him. So as I said previously, I think the reason SMiLE was never finished was many things. One thing for sure is I think Brian got caught up in the maze of SMiLE, in that he wasn't able to finish things like he used to be able to do. Like, take Heroes and Villains. He just kept doing parts and kept doing parts for it. And when you add all these things together, like some of the members of the Beach Boys not liking SMiLE, Brian's mental health issues at the time, his drug use, the lawsuit the Beach Boys were going through with Capitol, probably it was just too much, I think. I think it was just too much for the guy at the time. And SMiLE is one of those what-if records, because music at the time had such a cultural influence that you don't know how SMiLE would have influenced things. Like, people think, when you look at music now, like, it has an influence, but the influence of music back in the 60s was way more than it is now. Like, it just is. In popular music, it was way more. But what we have of SMiLE is beautiful and such interesting music that we should be thankful for that. Normally in these videos, I do a recreation of a track, but I thought I'd do something interesting for this one, where I would take different sounds from different tracks and recreate little parts of them. Brian would stack instruments on each other, so he would stack multiple pianos and stuff like that, and Windchimes has kind of multiple sounds stacked on it. To me, it sounds like it's got pianos, harpsichords and electric harpsichords stacked onto each other, so it kind of creates this sound. So for that, I have an acoustic piano, but I know people at home don't. So I used a virtual instrument, which I used Keyscape, which I don't think is a great sounding piano library. There's no real piano library that sounds like a piano. Like, they sound fine, but they just don't get that depth. But anyways, for this is just to show people how to get sounds, and if they have a piano home, they could do it. You know what I mean? In the sessions of Surf's Up, you can hear Brian say, "Now it sounds like jewellery." And this was Brian talking about the percussive element in Surf's Up. It's keys played. Some people say it's actually jewellery, but it's actually keys going back and forth on your hands. So, you know, I got a set of keys and I did that. And then I doubled it with the shaker as well to put it underneath, and then, you know, has the keys and stuff like that. So, yeah. You're My Sunshine has this eerie sound of the vocals, so I thought I'd try and achieve the sound. You were my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray. You were my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray. The 60s was a really innovative time for music technology because with the advent of tape and manipulating tape, you could get some really interesting effects like slowing the tape down and speeding it up. And also you could use tape feedback to get this really cool sound with things. So here's that tape feedback effect that Brian used on songs such as I'm in Great Shape. At some point, I'd like to do a video recreating a lot of the Beach Boys sounds because Brian used a lot of different sounds like muted pianos and tack pianos, and even for I Believe in You, Tony Asher and Brian plucked the piano, I think with a hairpin or something like that. So I could try and do that with my piano. But yeah, so thanks for watching the video. Take it easy. Goodbye.